by coming today to hear our guest speakers. I'm Kate Pickett. I'm Professor in Health Sciences here at the university, and I'm the university's research champion for justice and equality. And the reason I'm introducing our speakers is partly because I know them, but also partly because this event is being jointly hosted by YESI, the York Environment Sustainability Institute. Director Sue Hartley's here at the front, but also by the Food Resilience for All research project, of which I'm a part. And one of our speakers has graciously agreed to be on the international advisory group for that project, if we ever manage to get it funded. So Fora and YESI are jointly hosting this. And thank you so much to Helen and Sheila at YESI in particular, and to Sue for helping make this happen, and to Oliver from the Fora project. Tiny bit of housekeeping before I introduce our speakers. Loos are out the door, that way opposite. We're not expecting a fire alarm. If there is one, just bolt for the door and congregate outside. We are having a reception afterwards just outside, so do please stay and join us for a glass of wine or something else. But now more to business. I'm really delighted to introduce our speakers, Professor Robert Costanza and Dr. Ida Kubiszewski, who are joining us from Australian National University. They've been in Europe for other things, but they agreed to come to York, do a sort of side visit to York, to come and speak to us. There's quite a lot in the flyers that have been put around about their distinguished biographies and their contributions to international environmental science and policy. But really all you need to know is they're nice speakers and good people. My colleague Rich Wilkins and I have had the privilege of working with them in various places throughout the world. And Ida just gave me some slides that show that. So here we are in Bhutan. The four of us ringed. It's much more important actually that the king of Bhutan is there. She hasn't put a circle around him. And the Queen and the Prime Minister and various other dignitaries. But no, there we were. And also in Bhutan, at the top of a mountain, in Compton Verney in England, we've continued to work together as a group. Having met on a Bhutan project in China, and I think we'll be working there again. And we also did some work together in South Africa this year, which we took very, very seriously. And now York. So, as well as the talk they're giving today, we will be working with them on continued collaboration over the weekend. We hope that this is a collaboration that will connect Australia National University in York for some years to come. So, enough. Over to you guys.
Thanks so much, Kate. Thank you all for coming. So, what we want to talk about today is creating the future that we all want, and I think building some consensus on what that future could look like and how we might get there. Who's heard the term Anthropocene in this room? Just to gauge the audience. Okay, almost everybody. So, you know the story there. You know that we don't live in an empty world any longer. We live in a world that's full of humans and their artifacts. And we know, I think, that business as usual is not really an option going forward. So it's been said that the existing paradigm is really a utopian fantasy, and we have to create something really different if we hope to have a sustainable and desirable future. And I use both of those terms just to make it clear that we need to spend some more time thinking about what really is desirable and how we can communicate that with the larger public. So solving these kinds of complex problems, I think, requires that we integrate these three elements. Having a vision not only of how the world is, our scientific understanding of the world, and that's certainly been changing quite rapidly as we learn more about how complex systems function, how the Earth system functions, but also about human psychology and happiness and what actually does contribute to human well-being. So sort of bringing those things to bear, but also beginning to understand how we would like the world to be. what are our visions for the future, and how do we bring those into being, and integrating that emerging vision with the tools and analytical techniques and implementation strategies and policies and institutions, etc., that can help us really achieve this common goal. So on the science side, there's been a lot of work on complex systems, recognizing that this is a complex, nonlinear world with adaptations and thresholds and tipping points, and you can expect surprises. This is from a paper by Tim Lenton and colleagues a couple of years ago, just showing some of the tipping points in the climate system that could cause things to change really rapidly. In addition to the ice sheets melting, there's a whole range of other potential tipping elements having to do with changing the Indian monsoon or the ENSO or dieback of the rainforest, etc. So these systems are complex and hard to deal with. And there's also been a lot of work trying to identify, what is the safe operating space within this ecological life support system. Probably seen some version of this paper by Johan Rockström and several colleagues that tried to identify what the variables of importance here, and showing that in this diagram, climate change, biodiversity loss, and the nitrogen cycle are all already well outside what we tried to identify as the safe operating space. And several other variables are rapidly approaching that safe boundary. So there are fundamental ecological constraints on human activities on the planet that we have to begin to learn how to deal with. And this is sort of the way these environmental arguments are usually framed. That we're approaching the boundaries. We have to stop doing what we're doing. And however, this is not the movie that most people are lining up to go see. These are certainly truths, but they're not convenient, and people would rather, listen to reassuring lies that everything's fine and we can continue with business as usual. But I think part of the problem is how we frame these arguments, and I think what we really need is a third movie, a movie that talks about a sustainable and desirable economy in society, in nature. So fundamentally changing the worldview, changing our understanding, and recognizing that the economy is embedded in society and in the rest of nature. And this is all one integrated, complex system that we have to deal with. So it's a different way of looking at things. How do we do that? Well, the Rio +20 conference was titled "The Future We Want," and we wrote a report as input to that meeting with this title, how do we build this sustainable and desirable economy and society in nature, with a group of co-authors you probably recognize, including my colleague here today. So this goes into a lot more detail, I think, about some of the things I've been talking about. If you want to learn more about what the system that we envisioned and some of the policies about how to get there, you can take a look at that report. And this is also, I think, the fundamental worldview of ecological economics. And you probably know both ecology and economics come from the same Greek root, oikos, which means the house. Ecology is literally the study of the house, and economics is the management of the house. So ecological economics is trying to literally integrate as how we understand the world and how we manage it. It has these three integrated questions or goals. How do we build a ecologically sustainable scale or magnitude or size of the economy within society and the rest of nature? How do we attain a socially fair distribution of resources, both within the current generation of humans, but also between the current and future generations, and also between humans and other species? And finally, how do we achieve an economically efficient allocation of resources, recognizing that a lot of things that contribute to human well-being are not allocated in the market. They're outside the market, and non-marketed resources are natural and social capital. Thanks. And we do have a second edition of this introduction to ecological economics, which is right there, Kate, and maybe you can pass that around.
Sure.
Along with these hard copies of solutions journal, which we'll talk about a little bit later. So we want to talk also about, the importance of having a clear vision of where we want to go. As Yogi Berra once said, if you don't know where you're going, you end up somewhere else. So where are we going? And I think one significant thing that's happening is in September, the UN is going to implement the Sustainable Development Goals, transforming our world. They have an agenda that will replace the Millennium Development Goals. And they have these 17 goals, which are intended, in this case, to apply to all countries, not just to developing countries. You see that there are all of these things, I think, are the kinds of things we're talking about. But the way they've structured them is as 17 sort of independent boxes. And haven't really discussed a lot about how they interact with each other, how they contribute to a larger overarching goal, that is this sustainable and desirable future. I'll go through some of the details in a bit, but they certainly include this one. Yeah. So they include poverty and health, but also inequality, reducing inequalities within and among countries, also gender equality. They include the economic components. They include some environmental components. What we tried to do was to put these goals into this context and recognize that all of these goals are really sub-goals towards this overarching goal of a prosperous, high quality of life that's equitably shared and sustainable. That the environmental goals are sort of the base of this, the ultimate means for the production of that ultimate goal. And the intermediate means are the distribution and allocation. So we can sort of organize it or cluster these goals along those lines. And so if you put them in that clustering, there's 4 of the goals that are highly related to the staying within planetary boundaries or the sustainable scale, that have to do with taking urgent action on climate change, basically protecting marine and terrestrial resources and ecosystem services, and also water. The fair distribution goal has the most sub-goals of any of them. So I think they're paying a lot more attention to this issue of inequality and poverty. So I already said, gender equality, reduce inequality within and among countries. These are no longer proposed goals. They actually have a draft that will be ratified, I guess, in September. And finally, the building a living economy, or the efficient allocation set of goals that have to do with access to sustainable energy. This term, sustainable economic growth. I think there's a lot of argument about whether to call it growth or whether to call it prosperity or some other term that didn't necessarily imply growth. But this got left in there. They're very interested in sustaining it, whatever it is, sustainable. So anyway, so I think this is a significant thing that's happening in the world. The recognition, this will be signed onto by all of the UN countries, that we have a much broader set of goals, at least, than simply let's maximize the rate of growth of GDP. So just to step back a little bit, though, I think, unfortunately, a lot of the policy is still being made from the perspective of this empty world vision of the economy. That you can caricature something like this, that the primary factors of production, land, labor, and capital. Land is kind of grayed out because of the assumption of almost perfect substitutability among these factors. You don't really need land or natural resources. You can combine capital and labor to produce goods and services that are marketed goods and services measured by GDP, which are then either consumed or reinvested to produce more goods and services in the future. So there's nothing in this vision that would limit the growth of the economy, the growth of GDP indefinitely. And that's sort of the underlying assumption. We can have unlimited growth. That consumption is the major route to utility or well-being. The more we consume, the better off we are. But I think our transition to a full world, and it requires a different vision of the economy and its place in the world, and humans' place in the world, recognizing that we do live in a materially closed Earth system, that these four basic types of capital or assets are all required in some more balanced way to produce conventional goods and services, but also to produce well-being more broadly conceived. Recognizing that human well-being is a much more complex function than simply the more we consume, the better off we are. And that these four types of assets are all are not infinitely substitutable with each other. They're all required in a balanced way, including our built capital structure, the infrastructure, our human capital, individual people, their health, their information, social capital, all of the interactions, formal and informal interactions among people, our institutions, our cultures, all of that, and finally natural capital, everything else in the system that we didn't have to build or create, but which contributes very heavily to human well-being. So, our conceptions of what actually does create a high quality of life and a high level of well-being need to change as well. Recognizing that there's several elements that contribute to this. There's been a lot of work on subjective well-being and asking people in surveys, how happy are you, how satisfied are you with your life? But that subjective well-being, I think, depends on a whole range of basic human needs, going back to Maslow, but more recently Manfred Max Neef and Amartya Sen, Barbara Nussbaum. Recognizing that consumption, subsistence is really just one of the basic needs that people need to have fulfilled in order to feel this sense of subjective well-being. And that what we can do from a policy perspective then is to create the conditions, the opportunities for people to meet those needs, to feel this sense of subjective well-being by how we arrange our assets, our built, our human, our social, our natural capital, and how we allocate our time. So it's also important to recognize that these four types of capital, in order to produce sustainable well-being, need to interact in relatively complex ways. That natural capital produces ecosystem services, but only in combination with social, built, and human capital. So I think our challenge going forward is to begin to incorporate both the contributions of natural and social capital to well-being, and how we manage that system and understand it in order to create the kind of world I think that we all want. I've already talked about that. How we value these contributions have to do with understanding that complex interaction. And this is, I think, a very different view from the conventional one. So, I'm not sure I want to spend too much time on this part, but it's also possible, I think, to begin to model, to build computer models that get at this more complex interaction between humans and the anthroposphere and the rest of the world. How do we build? How do we begin to understand these interactions in a much more comprehensive and complex way? So we've done some work along those lines, and are continuing to do this sort of work. It can be done, at various scales, at various levels of resolution, including at the landscape scale. We can understand how patterns of development really affect the interaction between those four types of assets and how they contribute to producing well-being. One interesting study that we've done is to look at historical civilizations. There's a project that's part of the Future Earth initiative called IHO, Integrated History and Future of People on Earth. We're trying to understand how historical civilizations have grown and succeeded and sometimes collapsed. If you want to understand sustainability, it's important to understand the lack of sustainability and when civilizations collapse and why. So kind of taking up on Jared Diamond's idea, but trying to bring it to a more quantitative level. And so this is a study that we did of the Maya civilization that included a spatially explicit, fairly detailed, integrated sort of agent-based and process-based model of the Yucatan Peninsula, looking at population over time and forest cover and other natural capital assets and the trade network and soil degradation. And we were able with this model to reproduce the growth and the resilience of the system to the sort of regular drought cycles that they experience, but the ultimate collapse due to the sort of perfect storm of gradually decreasing natural capital, overextension of the trade network, growing population, and then a drought cycle hits. And so, using these sorts of simulations to help us understand those complex interactions and what we might learn from this about what's happening these days. Are we getting to a point in our current civilization where we're at the civilization is brittle and not really resilient to these kinds of shocks. And we're building now as part of a range of different exercises, including some of the ones that Ida will talk about later. The ability to model these kinds of complex systems at multiple scales in space and time, and to look at not only modeling them, but also getting individuals to interact with those models in a much more engaging way. Who here has ever played SimCity? Several of you. It turns out that the data that we had was that we as a species spend 3 billion hours a week playing computer games these days. So our idea is, well, if we can get some small fraction of that time spent playing computer games that may be a little more useful, both for an educational, from an educational point of view, but also from a research point of view. Because in these games you can keep track of all of the decisions that people make. You can then begin to understand how what trade-offs people are willing to make, how they learn about the interactions in these systems, and begin to use that to help us understand how people value natural and social capital relative to built infrastructure and other kinds of things. So I think this is a really important sort of research area. How do we begin to, and game theory and games, have been used quite a lot in the social sciences. But they've usually been applied to relatively small, groups of grad students, usually, in controlled settings, and relatively simple games. Whereas these days, I think we have the technology to be able to build fairly complex games, something along the order of this sort of model that could underlie the game structure. In fact, our vision is, to be able to take a Google Earth kind of interface and let the user identify any part of the planet, and then have a game that comes up that can help them to understand what's going on there and what might happen under different policy scenarios. So, now the social capital component, I think, is extremely important, and you probably, who has not seen this graph before in this room? Okay. So you got to everyone. That's good.
They didn't have much choice. Captive audiences.
And just recognizing that this distribution is really essential to quality of life and to well-being, and it has an extremely strong impact on this whole range of social problems and health issues. We know that inequality has changed quite a lot over the last century and a bit, going from in the 1900s very, very high levels of inequality. This particular one is the income share of the top 1% in these Western countries. But we knew we had policies that were gradually reducing that inequality in all of the developed countries until 1980. When Ronald Reagan and Margaret Thatcher came in and began to reverse that trend in almost all of these countries. So now we're back up to levels of inequality that we hadn't seen since the 20s or so. And this is having a massive impact. I don't know if you guys know about this experiment. Really interesting experiment they did at Harvard, where they asked a group of I think it was a fairly broad range of individuals, what in America, what they thought the distribution of wealth was, that was this middle bar, compared to what the actual distribution of wealth was, compared to what they would like it to be. And it's a pretty striking result. First of all, people didn't know how unequitably distributed wealth was at the time. But they also, that they really wanted it to be a lot more equitably distributed. So people's visions and what they desire in the world, and this future that we want, I think are getting far away from the kind of world that we actually have today. You get the same sort of relationship across U.S. states, not quite as strong a relationship, but still there. And this, I think, correlates quite well with this idea of social capital and other ways of measuring social capital. The more unequal the distribution is, the harder it is to build social capital in community. This is from Robert Putnam's book of several years ago, Bowling Alone, where he created an index of social capital based on participation in social clubs and bowling leagues and voter participation and a range of other things. And you can see there's quite a broad spectrum of social capital in the U.S. Anybody know what this state is? Nevada, yeah, Las Vegas and Reno. Not exactly the high point of social capital compared to New England and the northern Midwest, where the sense of community is much better. But it also statistically correlates with a range of things. The higher the social capital, the lower the murder rate, the lower the rate of TV watching among 4th and 8th graders, the higher the index of educational performance, the higher the what is that last one? The health index by state. So these effects among income inequality, social capital, various aspects of well-being, I think are very strong, and they're beginning to be more and more recognized. And we know that even though we focus so much policy on increasing GDP, there are significant diminishing returns to GDP in among a whole range of good things, but in this case, mean life satisfaction. So when you go and ask people in different countries, how satisfied are you with your life, you get a relationship that looks like this, where the U.S. and way over here people are not really any happier than they are in Costa Rica and Venezuela, with less than a third of the GDP per capita. So how do we get beyond this sort of focus on growth at all costs, as you might think of it, to create this sustainable and desirable future, the future that we want? Well, I think one approach and one question you can ask is, well, this is kind of well known, but why aren't we making progress? And I think one reason is that you can begin to think of this as an addiction, that there are all these positive feedbacks in the short term that tend to keep the system the way it is. So we've been doing some work on trying to draw parallels between what works in terms of breaking individual addictions, drug addictions, etc., and how you might scale that up to breaking societal addictions, to this growth at all costs paradigm, for example. And we know, from that sort of approach, at the individual level, the worst thing you can say to an addict is stop doing what you're doing. You're doing the wrong thing, and taking that very confrontational attitude. That immediately gets a defensive denial kind of behavior, and doesn't lead usually to very effective behavior change. And yet, that's exactly the kind of framing that we've been using, with a lot of environmental issues on society, and we're getting that same kind of reaction. So one thing that seems to work at the individual level is something called motivational interviewing, which is based on engaging in a more neutral way with the addict, trying to get some conversation going about the kind of future that they want, and whether what they're doing now is working for them, etc. So one analog of that we see at the societal level is something called scenario planning, where you try to engage society, or at least a large group of stakeholders, in beginning to think about what possible futures are. How do we envision a more sustainable future that can focus on quality of life? So we'll talk a bit more about that later. Let's see. So back to the natural capital components and this idea of ecosystem services. And okay, who's not ever heard the term ecosystem services in this room? If anybody. One, two, oh, a couple. Okay. The benefits that people derive from functioning ecosystems. This is from the Millennium Ecosystem Assessment a few years ago that categorized them into these four basic groups of provisioning, regulating, cultural, and supporting services, and how they contribute to all of these aspects of well-being that we've been talking about. One thing that's missing from this diagram, though, was this interaction with the other forms of capital that I talked about. So recognizing that it's not just ecosystem, not just natural capital flowing into human well-being, this is a complex system that requires the interaction of all of those elements. It's been getting a lot of attention recently. There's a new intergovernmental panel on biodiversity and ecosystem services, kind of the IPCC equivalent for ecosystem services and biodiversity. There's the Ecosystem Services Partnership that I've been involved in helping to set up. That's a place where you can go and see who's doing what in this area in terms of case studies, and it's an attempt to integrate the academic community and the practitioner community around this theme. In the academic area, there's been an exponential growth of publications on the topic of ecosystem services, with well over 1,000 publications a year on this topic. The most highly cited of those is this one that we did back in 1997, which was a meta-analysis of ecosystem services. We sort of looked at all of the studies that had been done at the time and came up with an estimate that was significantly larger than GDP at the time, in the range of 16 to 54 trillion dollars a year. Not that this was a very precise estimate, but it made the point that ecosystem services contributed a really significant amount to human well-being, and that we needed to do a lot more research with these areas. One thing we didn't control was what they put on the cover. They said pricing the planet, and we didn't really do pricing in the sense of exchanging these services in markets necessarily, because the whole point was most of them were not marketed, were public goods. And so we're really talking about valuing them in that sense, and beginning to think about how we could create the right institutions for managing these common assets in a more appropriate way. Okay, and I'm going to stop at that point. Yes, I think so.
No, you have about 4 more slides.
I'm sorry.
I can do them, but you wanted to. So.
I'm going to see a blank page there. Okay.
It's after the true cost stuff.
Okay. Yeah, we argue about how to divide this up.
We went back and forth.
Anyway, so more recently, as part of the TEEB study, the Economics of Ecosystems and Biodiversity, we sort of updated the unit values, the values per hectare per year of all of these different biomes across the 17 different services. And based on that, we tried then to estimate how had the value of these ecosystem services changed since 1997. And from that, we came to an estimate that because of largely the land use changes that occurred over that time period, we've lost about $20 trillion a year in the value of these services to humanity. This is sort of how we did it. I don't want to go into too much detail here, but it's based on changes in land use area, changes in updates in the value of those services. Almost all of them have increased, as we suspected, because as we learn more about how these systems are functioning and how they're connected with human well-being, those estimates increase. And then we can separate out the effects. This is the original 97 values updated to $2007. If we change only the unit values, then it increases to 145 trillion. So this is just an update of the estimate of the value. But if we change only the area, we can see that land use change, even with the old unit values, causes a decrease of 4.3, but with the new unit values, it causes a decrease of 20.2. So, of course, This idea of valuing ecosystem services and natural capital has a range of uses, including just raising awareness and interest, and I think that's been the main goal of the nature paper and its follow-ons, but it also can be and is being used to revise national income accounts, to incorporate those values into our estimates of national well-being, for specific policy analyses, for urban and regional land use planning, for this idea of payment for ecosystem services that we can encourage the right kind of behavior, like Costa Rica has done by paying individual landowners to produce, not just crops, but also a whole range of other ecosystem services. It can be used for full cost accounting. How do we understand the external costs of business activities and their impacts on natural capital? And finally, there's a whole range of new kinds of institutions that we can think about creating to manage those assets as common trust. So another thing that came out of the Millennium Assessment was the recognition that when you convert existing natural systems into agricultural or other uses, there's often a significant loss in value. You're gaining some private benefits, but you're losing a lot of social benefits, all of the other services that these ecosystems are providing. So you can think about, we did a cost-benefit analysis at the global scale and said, what if we instituted some policies to conserve our natural capital assets? And the scenario we used was to expand the global reserve network to cover 15% of the terrestrial biosphere and 30% of the marine biosphere. That would cost about $45 billion a year to create and maintain. But the net benefits would be the difference between that intact system and what it might be converted to, for about $4 to $5 trillion a year. So a benefit cost ratio in the range of 100 to 1. It's a really good investment these days. Can you think of any better investments in today's economy? The only one I could find was for oil companies investing in political campaigns in the United States, which unfortunately is about 400 to 1. Okay. So on the full cost accounting front, there's a company called True Cost, and there are a couple of other competitors that have come in recently, that tries to do just that. It estimates the external environmental costs by company, and so one of the conclusions that they've come to, and this is a recent study by True Cost and TEEB, that looked at just the primary processing sectors and estimated that they have unpriced natural capital costs in the range of $7.3 trillion a year. And that another conclusion of the study was that if these companies actually had to pay those external costs, they really wouldn't be making any profit at all. So how do you start thinking about, what is the social profit that companies are making? And, instead of allowing them to call these externalized costs profit, how do we bring those estimates into the system? This is also beginning to get some traction. There's something called the Natural Capital Declaration that several, particularly financial institutions, have begun to sign on to. This quote down below is the CEO of the National Australia Bank, who we've been working with to help them try to estimate the natural capital assets, in the farmers and the other firms that they're investing in, so that they can adjust their interest rates and their decisions about loans based on the sort of full range of assets that that their clients might have. This is their website. What? Am I taking too long?
No, this is me.
Should I hurry up?
No, this is my turn.
Oh, this is where we decided to switch. So I think you moved that blank page.
Okay.
Supposed to be a marker in there. No, that's fine. I'm ready.
Go ahead. No, go ahead. Keep going.
No.
We might have moved.
I think
Okay, keep going.
No.
We might have moved the marker. That's true.
I'm getting tired of talking anyway.
All right. You can tell here. Just check where the marker is. We've moved it so many times this morning that it's right there.
Okay,
You
all
want
right.
to do
I'll do a little bit more.
Either way.
So, anyway, this is from their website for NAB, just sort of reiterating some of the things I've been talking about, and their recognition that there is this value to nature that they need to begin to start bringing on board, and a lot of what they do has to do with agriculture in Australia. And this is from a paper by John Foley and others a few years ago, just pointing out the transition from a natural ecosystem which produces a whole range of services, not much in the way of crop production, to conventional intensive cropland, which focuses almost exclusively on producing crops and at the expense of all of these other services. Well, you can produce a different kind of agriculture that's a better balance between crop production and this whole range of services. Organic agriculture, but maybe even beyond organic agriculture, is something that does a better job of balancing those services. Part of that is how do you provide incentives to farmers, to produce this range of services. And there are some experiments with paying farmers, to do carbon farming and nutrient farming as well as crop production. An interesting study recently, I don't know who's run across this one before, the study by Ian Bateman and others in the UK National Ecosystem Assessment, where they looked at these 6 different scenarios for the UK based on different environmental regulation and planning policies and different spatial focuses of change, and things like world markets, which were kind of business as usual, to nature at work and green and pleasant land, which had stronger environmental regulations and more focused spatial changes. For each of those scenarios, they looked at this subset of ecosystem services. So in addition to the provisioning or conventional agricultural production, carbon sequestration, recreational amenities, and urban green space. And they also looked at bird diversity, with a range of different techniques. And for each scenario, then, they could look at, here's the value of the marketed agricultural products, compared to the non-market values from greenhouse gas, carbon sequestration, recreation, urban amenities, and then the relationship with biodiversity. And the bottom line there was something like this, that if they just focus on maximizing market values in the year 2060, those values would go up, but many of these other services would go down or would not go up nearly as much as otherwise. Whereas if they maximize all of the monetary values, both the marketed and the non-marketed, agricultural production would decrease a bit, but everything else would go up by a lot. So the bottom line here is that the value of the landscape could be dramatically improved by focusing much more broadly on this whole range of services. And that biodiversity, they threw in a biodiversity constraint that wouldn't really reduce that value by very much. Now we come to the blank page. Okay, thanks very much, and I'll turn it over to Ida.
How are we doing on time? So I know how quickly to speak.
It's 2:15.
Okay, so I'll be quick. So Bob has focused sort of on creating this picture, combining social, environmental, natural capital. What I'm going to do is I'm going to go into some of the specific case studies that we've worked on and talk about next steps as well. In terms of what we're working on now and kind of what society, sort of the 12-step program for society, sticking with the whole addiction metaphor. So one of the papers we're working on currently is, Bob showed the one we did where we looked at 1997 to 2011, what ecosystems did during that time, and then what the values did over that time, and we saw that there was a major decrease. What if you swap that and you looked into the future? So if you build 4 scenarios, so we built 4 scenarios, In the 4 scenarios, on one side we had, where's the pointer here? Individuals versus community. So what's the mindset of that society? And then focus on GDP growth versus focus on well-being. So same as Ian Bateman did in his UK paper, it's the idea of what kind of policies does society push. And you see that in this one, the market forces one, the very focus on individualism and GDP growth versus the opposite of great transitions where you focus on well-being and communities. And so if we did the same thing, and we looked at, here, they're the same numbers, 97 and 2011, as you saw before. But then what if we do that for, 97 and 2011, yeah. If you do that for 4 different scenarios. So for the 4 different scenarios, we basically looked at various studies that have done scenario planning before. And usually you find the same archetypes in every scenario planning. Not everyone, but there's kind of a general pattern. So we took those archetypes, created scenarios. There's a great site called the Great Transitions, put together by Paul Raskin, where they've been looking at these kind of scenarios for at least a few decades now. And what they have done is they looked at what each of these scenarios would do to various ecosystems around the world. And so you can see the red numbers are numbers that have decreased from 2011, or green numbers from 2000, increased from 2011. And so these are just the areas for these scenarios looking out to 2050. Now, if you map these areas, I know these are slightly, it's hard to tell the differences, but so this is the current 2011 map, but if you look at the global map, the red is urban. You could see differences between the 4 scenarios. So same axis as before, market forces on one side, great transitions, and the 2 in between. Now, if we look at the values, so these are the values from the 97 and 2011 paper. But if you now look at the values for the 4 scenarios, you see the major differences, especially here. So in 2011, we had $124 trillion versus an increase of 128 or 167, depending on what scenario you use. So there is that potential of significant growth globally in ecosystem services, but there's also the potential of major decrease. So you get a decrease here of about 30, 40 trillion dollars. Okay? Now, if you map these, you can see they connect in 2011, which we used as current, and what happens to the total annual ecosystem services. So these are values per year. So it's trillion of US dollars per year. We also are looking at, so we worked with GIS gurus, basically, to create this global model. And Bob talked about models. So this one looked at just the GIS model. So it took the land use, basically areas, and then adjusted the global map based on those changes land use. So increased urban when needed be, decreased forests or deserts, etc. as needed be. And then once we did that, we can pull out each country individually or region individually and look at those by themselves. In this case, we looked at Kenya. Kenya, you can see, so here's you have current and current value. Here is what the land use cover is, and then where the changes are. So I know it's slightly hard to tell, hence we put in the changes. These round circles is because the way the model was created, as I said, this is a work in progress, so we're still playing with this. So these maps will change slightly. But what we ended up doing was, if you had 1 pixel desert, and in a scenario where you had desert growing, that pixel grew out. And hence the sort of circular deserts in these 2. So we're working on fixing that. And then what happened to the values? So you see the negative drop in value, and then the slight positive. And this is Kenya. And so each country didn't necessarily, the values didn't change by the same percentage as they did globally, depending on what happened in that country. But what you can do is, you can go into a country like Kenya or any other country and do what New Zealand did. So they created 4 scenarios. They used participatory process to create 4 scenarios. But what they did, which is really interesting, and nobody else really has done, is then they took those 4 scenarios and brought them back to the public and said, 1, which one would you want to live in? So here's the current, so here's basically, it's the same archetype scenario. So which direction you want to go. And they asked people where they wanted to go by 2055, and then where they thought they were going. And so the goal there was to see whether the country was moving in the direction people actually wanted it to go. And they found that there was a big difference. So most people were grouped here where they wanted to go. Most people thought this is where they were going. And so that's sort of the next step for a lot of what we're doing with scenarios. We're doing the same thing in Australia at the moment, of putting together 4 scenarios, but then taking them out to the public to see what they want to do. Another sort of big push we're doing right now is looking at indicators of well-being. So this is a paper we published in Nature beginning of 2014 with Kay Pickett and Richard Wilkinson as co-authors. And what we looked at was what kind of indicators were out there. So here is a table, and these are just some of them. There's actually hundreds of them out there. In this case, we looked at some of the biggest ones. There's 3 groupings. So the first grouping is ones that they take GDP and adjust it somewhat. So there's a lot of issues with GDP, and as most people know, and so they try to fix it in some way. So this is the group, and I'll talk more about the GPI, the Genuine Progress Indicator, in a minute. Then there's the subjective well-being. So Bhutan does, for example, the gross national happiness, where they ask people, what's your well-being in some ways. It's a long process usually with many questions that try to get at this idea. And then there's sort of composite indicators of indicators that take, let's say, like HDI takes life expectancy, health, education, GDP, and puts it together into some kind of indicator. The OECD has also started working on this idea. They call it the Better Life Index. The interesting thing about the OECD is, so you go on and you get a default of they have about, I think there's about 12 different indicators that they composite. So this was part of this set, where it's a composite indicator. One of the biggest issues with composite indicators, any indicators, is weighting. So do you weigh education more? Do you think it's more important? Or life expectancy? Or financial status? What's the most important aspect? And what they did, when you go on the site, and everybody can go to the site and you'll see the same thing, is they put all the weights the same. However, they give people the option to change those weights based on what they feel is accurate for their own lives, and then submit that. And so OECD is actually collecting all that data to see what people feel is the most important aspect in their lives. So one of the indicators that we have worked with significantly is the Genuine Progress Indicator. It used to be known as ICW, which was very similar. There's minor adjustments, so often use them interchangeably. There's some issues with that, but they're close. So what GPI does is it takes personal consumption expenditure, which is a big component of GDP, and adjusts it. So one of the things it adjusts for is income distribution, but then it adds and subtracts things. So it adds things like value of household labor, volunteer work, highways and streets, and then it subtracts the losses. So the negatives: crime, family breakdown, underemployment, pollution, water pollution, leisure time, loss of leisure time, cost of commuting, cost of automobile accidents, and then a bunch of other environmental capital aspects. And so what it tries to do is take GDP and fix it, adjust it. No indicator is perfect, including this, but we're basically saying it's better at measuring well-being than GDP is. So what we did a paper that looked at multiple countries. In this case, it's the US. So you see that GDP continues going up. Around 1970, 78, 79, GPI leveled off and decreased a little bit. So basically, as Herman Daly puts it, while these two are going up together, you have economic growth. And after that's uneconomic growth. And I'll show you a little bit more of that. Other states in the US have started using GPI as an official indicator. So the first government agency that has started doing that is the state of Maryland, where they still measure GDP, but they also measure GPI. The interesting thing is that they start coming out with press releases like this, where GDP might have gone down, but they basically say, you know what, it's okay, because unemployment has decreased, pollution has decreased, we have more parks. Things are actually better, even though GDP decreased. So they're trying to make sure that the population knows what they're measuring. Since then, there's been other states. So Vermont has now also started using it. Oregon, Utah, Colorado, Hawaii. There's about 5 or 6 others that are thinking about it and started calculating it. So the paper we did looked at 17 countries. Here's the 17 countries, and this is the GPI per capita for these 17 countries. You see that often the trend is the same as we saw in the US, where GPI grows for a while and then levels off or decreases. There are exceptions. Exceptions often happen when there's a major government change and major policy changes. So Bob talked about Thatcher and Reagan. There are changes there. Instability, and so for example, if you look at here, this one going down and there's a big drop and come up, this is Poland. You know, what happened around 1990. So that will also quickly change GPI. So here's the US again, and what we did was we put together, so this is an index around 1980. So you see the blue is GDP, GPI is in red, and you see the leveling off around here. But then we also included the ecological footprint, biocapacity, life satisfaction, which is a subjective well-being measure, and in this case, HDI, which is the UN indicator. Now, the interesting thing about it, take a look here. So, because this is indexed, you see how much this grows. So it goes up to 180. Look at China. You see the same pattern. GDP and GPI continue up till about 1995, at which point GPI levels off, GDP keeps going up. 400. So just same index. The reason we found that with a lot of the GPIs, why they end up leveling off is 1 was inequality, and 2 was environmental damage, where the growth in GDP outweighed the costs to society, to the environment, etc. So we put those 17 countries together. The 17 countries made up about 60% of the world population and about 68% of the global GDP. The big major continent that was missing was Africa. That was not intentional. It's just because no country in Africa has done the GPI at this point. So we do expect that if that was done, the trend would be similar. But we're working potentially with South Africa to do that. So if you put the 17 countries together, you see the same trend. Around 1978, GPI levels off, GDP keeps growing. So as Herman Daly put it, economic growth during this time and uneconomic growth after that. You've already seen this graph, Bob put it up, about planetary boundaries. What we need to do now, though, is look at the planetary environmental boundaries in the context of society. How many have heard of the sustainable, desirable donut? Okay, so about a third of you. So this was a publication out of Oxfam where they talked about living within the donut. So now what if you look at the environmental constraints we are in globally, but then what kind of society would we have to live in? One, to create that increased well-being, but then live within the constrained society. And so here are some of the elements of the well-being that were identified, and making sure that, you know, people are healthy, educated, there is a fair society, security, identity, etc. So, about, just checking time. Oh, there it is. Okay, I'm almost done. I have a few more slides. A few years ago now, I want to say about 6 or 7 years ago now, independently, but simultaneously at the same time, Peter Victor and Tim Jackson wrote these 2 books, and they basically looked whether it's possible to have a prosperous society without growing GDP. The interesting thing that Peter Victor did, was, so both of them are traditional economists. What Peter did was he created a model using a very standard macroeconomic model, and he wanted to see whether you can create a society, and in this case he used Canada as an example, and whether you could create a society that was stable without GDP growth. And so he found that if all he did was take the regular macroeconomics model and stop GDP growth, he got a collapse. Things went out of control, society basically collapsed. However, if he did a various set of policy changes, he found that he could create a society where GDP per capita stabilized, but so did a lot of the other issues. So poverty went down, if not stabilized. Unemployment went down and stabilized. Debt, greenhouse gases. He was able to create that society. And what he found was that the 12-step program that a society has to take to be able to do that was, 1, new meanings and measures of success. So we talked about various measures. If not GDP, then what? How do we create that? 2, limits on materials, energy, waste, and land use. 3, more meaningful prices. Making sure the externalities are within those prices, the ecosystem service damages are within those prices. Make sure that people are informed about what they're buying and what impact that's having on the world. More durable, repairable products. We don't all need an iPhone every year. If it breaks, let's try to repair it. So, fewer status goods. Let's move away from the idea that we need something just because all our friends have it, just because that's the brand that's in right now. More informative advertising, less advertising to children. Better screening of technology, more efficient capital stock, more local, less global, reduced inequality, less work, more leisure. Who objects to that one? Education for life, not just work. So those were basically the 12 steps that he found that if he changed policies around those 12 things in his model, he got a stable society. So one of the projects, I have like 2 more slides. One of the projects we just started is something called Claim the Sky. So I'm a UN negotiator for climate change, and I've been going to negotiations for a few years now. And it's like hitting a brick wall every time. It's slow. We already know we're not going to get anything substantive in Paris. There's various issues. And so our thinking was, what can we do that doesn't require the UN, doesn't require sort of that international negotiation? And so a project we started is called Claim the Sky. And the idea behind it is that we all own the sky. It's a common good. It's a common property. And there's no reason, and there's why companies should be polluting and emitting into that atmosphere without paying us for that property. So we're taking this twofold. One is getting sort of the public movement and trying to have people say, you know what, I claim my piece of the sky. And then on the second front,